Good evening. My name's James Baker. I'm a convener here of the IHR Digital History Seminar, and I'm delighted that we're back for our 10th full year of seminars with a wonderful range of talks. My name's James Baker. I'm a convener found on our website and via our YouTube channel. I'm also, however, the bearer of bad news, and unfortunately I want to start with a little bad news. In July, we lost Richard de Swan. Richard was a founding convener of the IHR Digital History Seminar. He was a colleague, a friend, a stalwart, an after-seminar pub trip organizer, the kindest and most generous seminar chair, the writer of the longest and most thoughtful emails, a man who always had time for us, perhaps a little bit too much time, often with an apology, kindest and most reply or having missed a detail, an indication of the time we all knew Richard had for people like us and people other than ourselves. I don't claim to have known Richard especially well, and it was clear from the memorial event that University of East Anglia held over the summer that many parts of Richard's life I knew little of until his death. But to speak of Richard in the past tense still pains me, and I know if it pains me, it must still devastate those to whom he was closest. I'll miss Richard most in this space, online or at the Institute of Historical Research, in this space for discussing historical research made possible by the use of computational technologies, but also a space kind of always bubbling under the surface for reflecting on our collective navigation of the digital Anthropocene. For Richard, the latter manifests itself in the web, in our use of it as a source, as an accidental archive, a place from which we might make meaning of social change. We as a group of conveners then will have to adjust to lacuna created by Richard's loss, the spaces where his perspective on history, his very particular, open, constructive line of questioning, and above all, his voice, his very distinctive voice, will be absent. That then is one way in which we'll remember him because of his absence. But I'm also delighted, such as it is, that we'll be remembering him in a more formal sense. Today, then, I'd like to announce that with permission from Richard's family, the Institute of Historical Research Digital History Seminar will in due course be launching the Richard de Swan Prize in Digital History, an annual prize that will celebrate the best of digital history, funded with generous support from the School of Advanced Study and some to be confirmed sponsors. More details will follow. In the meantime, we regroup and keep working in Richard's honour. If you had the pleasure of encountering Richard in and around our seminars and you wish to make a contribution to his memory, I direct you to rememberingrichardswan.com, where you can find links to places where to make suggested donations. Now, with a heavy heart, we move on to the business for tonight, and a wonderful speaker, Harry Raffal, someone whom we've been trying to get, I think, for some time. Harry is a historian at the Royal Air Force Museum, who works on air power, military culture, and armed forces recruitment, and has been known to dabble as well in things like web archives. Today, he'll be talking about virtual reality, in a sense, speaking on the topic history in the round, virtual reality and historical understanding. He'll be speaking for roughly 45 minutes, after which we'll have time for questions, which can be put on the YouTube chat or via the hashtag DHist on Twitter. And I will hand over to Harry.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, James. It's quite a poignant moment for me to speak because, as many of you will know, Richard was a lovely guy, and I originally arranged to speak. Well, thank you very much for at the IHR seminar with Richard, so it's a bit of a sad moment for me. But I'm going to begin with a caveat, which I hope Richard would enjoy, which is that I'm not an expert in the technological development of virtual reality, but rather I'm going to offer a perspective as a historian on that medium of communications. And to explore the topic, I'm going to examine in detail Immersive History's Dambusters virtual reality installation at the RAF Museum, and where useful, refer to other historical virtual reality experiences in comparison. I'm going to explore how virtual reality affects historical understanding, in particular through the experience they claim to provide. But by no means do I have time to discuss all the various aspects of the subject, so I'm happy to speak about the different ones which we don't get to cover in the question and answer section. So before I move on to sort of consider the historical understanding aspect, I think it's worth spending some time talking about virtual reality itself. For something to be considered virtual reality, it requires 4 essential elements: a virtual world, which requires a cohesive environment incorporating objects bound by rules and relationships, which offers a spatial experience and which is generated by a computer; immersion, the sensation of being physically present in the virtual world; sensory feedback, sensory data about the virtual world provided on the basis of users' presence and action; and interactivity, the responsiveness of a virtual world to the choices made by the user. We can therefore define virtual reality as a medium composed of interactive computer simulations that sense the participants' position and actions and replace or augment their feedback to one or more senses, giving the feeling of being mentally immersed or present in the simulation, a virtual world. And virtual reality is a means of communicating the ideas and vision of the creator, but it also depends on the interpretation of the participant. Each individual user will bring their own interpretation of the virtual reality based on who they are. These are both then important elements to consider, particularly in regard to historical virtual reality. Indeed, VR offers a new medium with which to communicate complex ideas and to reach a new audience who might be far less receptive to traditional methods of communication employed in history. Now, historical virtual reality creations are variously described as representations, recreations, visualizations, and experiences. Of these, recreations is particularly suggestive that a historical VR considers itself to be a true recreation of the past and therefore highly accurate. In this paper, however, I'm going to use the term experiences to cover all historical virtual realities. And I do so because whether highly faithful attempts to build an accurate portrayal of the past, or recreations of a well-known event in high fidelity, or simply an element of creation of a portrayal of the past, all of the historical virtual realities involve an element of the experiential. Indeed, many historical virtual realities are explicitly marketed as experiences, and even when they are not, it remains a core characteristic of historical virtual reality. The user is not just viewing the past, they are immersed, experiencing it and witnessing it. And as an example of this, I'm going to start with the Anne Frank House VR tour. Because while providing information is a crucial part of the tour, the user is still experiencing the virtual world. Anne Frank's house described the tour as an immersive experience. And just to note, it's an incredibly important use. It's very moving. If you've been to Anne Frank's house, you'll know that it isn't furnished. And so that's the big step in that this virtual reality world makes. However, it raises a challenge for the creators because in some cases, there is no certainty over those furnishings. And so we've had to make representational decisions. It's a point which is fully acknowledged by the creators, but how to make those choices where there's an absence of certainty is a difficulty in virtual reality. And this is a point about not making a claim for more detail than we know, and it's been made in these seminars before. Matthew Nichols, in encountering this problem as it related to statues in his virtual recreation of Rome, utilized generic humanoid shapes, which provided a sense of perspective and the idea of statues without suggesting more definite knowledge. In 2019, Nico Munz discussed this issue in relation to the Whitehall Palace visualization. And in Anne Frank's house, they draw on the descriptions provided by her diary, and they make use of period furnishings to provide a representation. And by doing so, they provide a meaningful visualization. But I've specifically used the term historical understanding in the title of today's talk. And it's a concept we often take for granted, but it's important to distinguish that whilst it is structured on historical knowledge, it also requires historical reasoning, a degree of empathy, and reflection on the meaning of the past. Therefore, historical understanding cannot be said to have been improved where a historical VR experience only transfers a rudimentary knowledge of the past. I mean, many people can tell you that the Battle of Hastings was in 1066, but unless you know the significance of that battle, knowledge of the date alone denotes no historical understanding. Therefore, at the minimum, historical understanding through virtual reality relies on a sufficiently sophisticated degree of knowledge, including aspects such as empathy and emotion, having been provided to allow the user to reflect and reason on the past, either during the experience or subsequent to it. And to discuss that, I'm going to look at the RAF Museum's Dambusters virtual reality experience and present it as a case study from which to explore a number of key issues in terms of virtual reality and historical understanding. As with nearly all historical VR, experiences of the Dambusters are marketed as being authentic, realistic, and an experience. However, Dambusters experience goes beyond this, and it is claimed that users are completely immersed, flying at merely 60 feet altitude. The trees and dam whoosh past at a speed of 232 miles per hour. Yet this is not a thrill-seeking ride. This is a historically accurate document. With input from number 617 Squadron official historian, its level of accuracy is astounding and relies on actual crew memoirs. So it's therefore claimed not only to be an experience, but a historically accurate document. And it was that claim in 2019 which really piqued my interest in how virtual reality could be said to influence historical understanding. How was it that people who were going through this experience conceived of the Dambusters raid after going through compared to what they had done before? It's a 10 minutes experience. It's to do it, you're charged £10. It wasn't originally designed for the RAF Museum, which I think is a really important point. It was driven from a PC. It features head-mounted displays, haptic vests, and hand tracking. And the haptic vests in particular provide a deeper multi-sensory immersion, and this integration can deepen the empathy from VR. It also features a physical set, which has been spatially mapped. And for this reason, we could classify it as mixed reality because aspects of the virtual environment also exist in the user's real environment and time. However, whilst it enhances the immersive feeling, improving the user experience, the physical objects aren't interactable. The radio display, for instance, is just a blank plywood board. If you decided you wanted to break the table, it wouldn't be broken in the virtual world. It isn't immersive. I don't know about you, but it's important to me to know that when I break something, it's broken in every time and possible place I could ever be. So it's an incorporation of the physical and virtual world, but it's subsidiary to the main and entirely virtual aspects of the experience, the attack on the dams. So really, it's a characteristic of passive haptics within virtual reality. The experience itself has been situated within the RAF Museum's Dambusters exhibition, which includes, amongst other things, a recreation of Barnes Wallis's office using the original fittings and design models for the bouncing bomb, which he designed. Now, the effect of this incorporation is relevant to the historical understanding in location-based historical VR exhibitions. The interpretation in the exhibition space was refreshed to bring it up to date with the museum's style, but otherwise no additional content was provided to contextualize the experience either before or after users had engaged with it. And that's true of the entire museum. There's nothing additional added to help interpret this virtual reality. And that was a point of frustration recorded by a number of users in subsequent audience surveys. They went through this virtual reality experience, they felt they had gained a sense of what it had been like to be on these raids, but then they received no further historical interpretation and they were left wanting more. And perversely, the installation, because of its obtrusive nature, notices of charging, and the permanent staffing which was located there, had the effect of making the exhibition itself feel less accessible for visitors not using the virtual reality experience. And the RAF Museum is not alone in having struggled to effectively integrate virtual reality experiences into the wider museum experience. A common trend is to see virtual reality in museums situated where it's convenient to the exhibition and sitting apart from it, rather than being fully integrated and with interpretation to match onto it. And that's true for other location situated VR and augmented reality experiences, particularly those which include bring your own devices, where you're using your own phone or tablet. Integrating those experiences effectively requires a great deal of thought if they are to aid historical understanding. For a start, users are often reluctant to download a single-use application, and even when they do not need to, they have concerns regarding the battery life, their data allowance, they might not be able to connect the internet. So it's really something which is you need to have usability at the forefront of your mind if you're going to incorporate these for it to aid historical understanding or the wider museum visitor experience. If your content is fantastic, but no one is using it because it's too difficult, or it's not clear how to use it, then your outcomes are going to be reduced. So whilst historical virtual reality experiences can offer the opportunity to enhance the visitor-centered museum experience and historical understanding, ad hoc inclusions do not necessarily do so. And you can see the size of the space in the middle picture here, but Barnes Wallis's office on the left. A more thoughtful integration of virtual reality experiences would improve the historical understanding which could be derived from them. In doing so, users could gain an empathetic and emotional insight into the past with interpretation before and after providing deeper historical understanding. Such an approach would also enhance the museum experience by providing novel, high emotional content for the individual, which was supported by later experiences in the museum. And that's been demonstrated previously to deepen the memory of the content and so enhance the experience. And I think it's fair to suggest that would also be true for the historical understanding you'd gain. So there's no extra interpretation within the museum. Instead, what the Dambusters VR experience does, in common with many historical experiences, including at-home VR experiences, is offer additional historical interpretation within the virtual reality experience itself, both before and after the user is immersed in the virtual world. The attempt is to contextualize the experience and then subsequently to provide for historical understanding. For instance, in the Dambusters virtual reality, the German civilian casualties are explicitly mentioned afterwards within the text. Now, does this work? I would suggest that post-virtual reality interpretation is quite limited in its effectiveness where users lack pre-existing knowledge. Having just gone through a really visceral experience, offering textual interpretation to the user has a reduced impact. Additionally, it acts as a marker that the experience is over. If you imagine you're at a film and you see the credits rolling, it's not the point where you decide you're really going to pay attention because you've got to know who that second producer was. Instead, you're getting ready to leave. So it breaks the user's immersion and receives less attention, and it's simply not memorable. The text beforehand seems to get more attention, but I've serious doubts as to its long-term recall. And again, if we think about films or TV programs, we've often seen text before them. It's not particularly memorable. It provides the context, but it's not the basis on which we gain deeper knowledge or understanding. And so it also strikes me as counterintuitive that virtual reality is relying on text to do the heavy lifting of historical understanding. This is a medium that sells itself through learning through living. And instead, we have to use text at the end to try and make up this deficit. Now, turning to Dambusters, before this experience was situated in the exhibition space, it wasn't being used to display objects from the collection. So if you can see in the middle picture, behind the guy with a truly horrible moustache, you'll see it's quite a large area. And what was in there was the Dambusters film. So the users were being provided with a virtual interpretation, just not through virtual reality. We've talked about how the inclusion of the VR area stopped users being able to go in. Well, when the Dambusters film was there, visitors pressed a button, the film would play, showing the bombing run and the destruction of the dams. But in order to do that, the lighting for the film and the projection meant that the lights in the Barnes-Wallis office were completely extinguished. You couldn't really see it. All the interpretation was hidden and it was shrouded in darkness. So where the virtual reality casts a figurative shadow over the exhibition, the film which was previously there actually cast an entire pool over the display. So I've noted that the virtual reality wasn't designed by the RF Museum. It was designed by Immersive Histories, and their creators have stated that they developed it from a desire to move past the notion of do not touch notices in the museum, and instead, sorry, that's the wrong one. Yes, there it is. Okay, so to move past do not touch notices in the museum, to take an audience to a place and time impossible to visit, to develop a deeper understanding of people, objects, and events. They've also said that they were trying to create an accurate historical portrayal of what it would have been like to inhabit in a specific time and place in history, so that audiences can learn and understand in ways which are not always possible through conventional media. But despite these statements, it's a commercial company, and it was designed deliberately because the Dambusters is established in public memory, and it could be marketed to a pre-existing audience. So historical understanding was not the primary driver for their development. However, it doesn't mean it wasn't a significant concern, because successful immersion in historical virtual reality experiences is dependent on the user identifying the virtual world created as being accurate and authentic. If that doesn't happen, immersion doesn't happen, and so the VR itself isn't successful. The accuracy of the virtual world and the experiences derived from it drive the historical understanding derived from virtual reality. And though it wasn't the underlying motive of the creators, when they brought it to the museum, it certainly was the museum's prime concern. They wanted to make sure that this was accurate, not least because if it wasn't, they'd have caught a load of stick about it. So the first thing that they did was they gave the first iteration a test run with historians, including the squadron historian and the curators at the museum. And they then drew on their knowledge and expertise to ask for a number of historical accuracy and interpretation changes within the experience. And the designers agreed to those changes, and apparently they were very keen to take them on board. I wasn't at the museum at this time, but having spoken to people who were there, apparently the creators were really receptive to this process, which to an extent shows that VR creators need to achieve a greater degree of accuracy as possible, and they recognise that authenticity is a vital aspect. However, it's also the case that if they hadn't done that, they might not necessarily have had their experience placed in the RF Museum, and it's then run on a cost-sharing basis. So there's mixed motives, as I think there always are with these things. So the effect on historical understanding. To understand the effect that the Dambusters VR experience might have had on historical understanding, we've got a number of different audience surveys. One of the ones that I'd hoped to do in quite a lot of depth was unfortunately thwarted by COVID-19. Indeed, the Dambusters VR still isn't open, so there's very legitimate hygiene concerns. It's very difficult to run these things at the moment. So it's quite a limited survey that I managed to do in the end. It isn't statistically significant, so less than 50 people. And one of the survey groups also involved students from the Royal Holloway Public History MA. So as well as being the fact that we asked users explicitly beforehand to consider the event, these things all will have influenced the results regarding how people reflected on the VR. So caveats out of the way. I should also say we also ran a survey using the Dambusters film as a sort of control or a point of comparison. It's probably a better way of describing it. And we also gave users an action card because we felt that we needed to see whether or not providing some context would help in terms of historical understanding. This was also because in previous feedback, both from users of the Dambusters VR and other historical VR recreations, we'd noticed a tendency for users to become absorbed in the visceral element. The visualizations, they're very striking. People spend more time looking at the sky, the clouds, the countryside passing by, than on the aspects we might want them to. It's not always the case, but it's quite common. And in the experience of the French tunnel visualization, which Virginia Tech did, that was something that they also experienced. And to try and counter it, they introduced a passive haptic device in the form of a lantern, which was then linked to the VR, and it helped ensure users actually focused on the tunnels they passed through, as many users had finished the experience having missed the detail, because their attention had simply been caught by the technology. Now, these action cards were meant to determine if a definite prompt for reflection would lead to a different result in historical understanding. And the clear reference to anti-aircraft firing card was felt to be important. It's a noticeable element of the raid, and within the VR recreation, users can feel the anti-aircraft fire through the haptic vests. So it's one of the key elements of it. The remaining elements were left deliberately vague so that the cards did not skew the wider results. And as a representative result, this survey is quite a good one. The only real difference from this one to quite a lot of those we did with, say, the Royal Holloway cohort was that they didn't have a particularly good understanding of the Dambusters beforehand. Sort of we'll see that in a moment. You'll know that anti-aircraft fire is mentioned, and in general, a more thoughtful understanding of Operation Chastise seems to have been held after the event than before. And almost all of those who had an action card noted the anti-aircraft fire. But that number was also high for those who didn't have the card. Around 80% still mentioned anti-aircraft fire explicitly. If we were doing this again, I think I'd probably change the action cards to have a few different ones to see whether we could pick up different aspects of historical understanding. Because by comparison, the film users were far more likely to mention, when it came to the difficulties of the raid, the difficulty of flying at the right height to drop the bombs. That's a real key aspect of the history behind the Dambusters. It's made, great play of it is made in the film, and it's probably a more nuanced understanding of the difficulties they actually faced. And VR users did not demonstrably add this to their understanding. With reference to altitude, it was only made on the surveys if it had been referenced before. So nobody added this afterwards, which is crucial because this is one of the key aspects to the raid success. They needed to fly at a set height. It's very difficult to do. And that included the action card groups, where, if you remember, their attention was explicitly drawn to the preparation time. So that didn't factor into this at all. Nevertheless, based on these surveys, it was possible to detect a change in historical understanding pertaining to the Dambusters raid. It was small but significant. It's also interesting to note that knowledge of Barnes-Wallis was not enhanced in any of the virtual reality users surveyed. If they knew about it before, they might write about it. 2 of the users recorded before the virtual reality experience, but they thought Barnes-Wallis was an RF bomber pilot, and they still held that view afterwards. That's the case of any number of VR users surveyed. They had an extremely limited knowledge before undertaking VR experience, and it wasn't changed on the terms of Barnes-Wallis. That's despite the fact they waited in the exhibition space for the virtual reality experience next to his office and the collection and the interpretation around him, and they completed the subsequent survey sitting next to those same objects. So a bit of a worry, because knowledge of Barnes-Wallis is important for historical understanding of the Dams raid. The lack of such knowledge suggests either that the virtual reality experience needed additional content, or perhaps more likely that the effort should have been made to better integrate that virtual reality into the museum experience. So yeah, a bit of a sad story, that one. Did it actually impact historical understanding? I think we can say that it did. You can see here, one of the questions we asked was their overall views. And in this case, somebody recorded it was a very effective method to make someone interested in the topic and understand it more. I think that's probably true throughout. There was a sense of empathy generated and people did understand it more. So as well as these surveys, we also did some post-user surveying through email. And doing that, we can examine how successful this particular instance of historical VR was in altering the patterns of participation. Because I think what we'd really like to see is that people come and use these experiences because they're into virtual reality, not because they're into the Dambusters. Because that's not a, you're not extending your reach then. And of those who paid to use the Dambusters VR, almost 90% strongly identified with the statement either keen interest in the RAF and or military aircraft. 60% were between 56 and 75. The survey group was about 80% male. None of the respondents had a disability, and 88% either stated their ethnicity was white British or manually entered white English, the remainder identifying as white other. So if that's consistent with the entire user base, and I should say here, but I've actually seen quite a wide range of people going through the VR, lots of families as well. And this probably reflects more on who has the time to fill in email surveys rather than who is using the VR. But it does suggest it wasn't wholly successful in broadening access. But it may be useful as well to note from these the things that people were writing when we asked them to reflect on their general experience. And the feedback recorded from the survey in the main was extremely positive. And in the comments, these are representative, over 80% of those surveyed either directly described their experience in those words or used comparable terms such as witnessing or feeling what it was like. And all of the surveying suggested that users held a sense of having experienced the past. So if we just move quickly on to the 1943 Berlin Blitz VR experience, because that came out roughly at the same time as the Dambusters was entering the RF Museum. It's also set in a Lancaster, and it was released for home virtual reality users. It recreated a particular raid which was able to draw on the original wartime audio from the BBC correspondent Winford Vaughan Thomas. And as with the Dambusters experience, one of the striking visual elements within the VR is the anti-aircraft fire, which is described as feeling for them all the time in the original recording. The user sees the attack made on Berlin, and at the time, Vaughan Thomas described the site of Bomber Command attack as the most beautifully horrible sight I've ever seen. And you can see what that looks like in the VR, which I think is probably not representative. The Berlin Blitz and Dambusters VR, as with other historical VRs, are designed to communicate that authentic sense of place, what it might have been like to be there, and to enable audiences to learn and understand in ways which are not always possible through conventional media. Now, this is the Virginia Tech Visualizing History Team's tunnel project. I won't say the actual name of it because I feel that I will butcher it, my French being appalling. But it's a VR installation which provides both a virtual and physical tour of historic World War I tunnels. And the experience is about empathy and feeling as much as information and history. And the ability to convey a sense of empathy is a crucial addition to our historical understanding of the past. And I do think it's something that VR can achieve, at least in some measure. But various different surveys suggested that a sense of empathy had been provided from Dambusters VR, and that's in line with feedback provided by other VR experiences, which we've received both from designers or when you speak to people who have used them. But I want to make a very explicit point about these historical VR experiences, which are set amidst war or conflict. The users are not coming away with a sensation which in any way approximates the feeling of those who lived that moment. The experiences can be viscerally stimulating. They may excite and cause users to catch their breath, but they don't come close to the experiences of war. I don't think anyone would pretend they could. And yet people are being sold the claim that you'll experience what it must have been like. That's an explicit statement the RF Museum makes. I mean, I don't think that's even close to being true. It can generate a real sense of empathy and emotion, but as recreations, they don't come close. And I think there's a real danger in historical understanding when we try and suggest that they could. What we can do is provide a form of living history. Indeed, virtual reality designers have claimed that through virtual reality, it is possible to learn by living it. And this represents a continuation of learning based on visuals, material culture, and learning by doing, which has been part of a pattern of education since at least the 1920s. But one of the companies involved in developing VR experiences in the historical sector point to the benefit for immersive learning, and educators using VR empower students to experience history from a first-person perspective, inspire them to inquire, and fuel a desire to learn more, very much a sales pitch. But by using VR, they claim to activate history, and so provide the opportunity to not only read about historical places and events, but engage with it. And there certainly are learning opportunities and the potential to expand historical understanding by utilizing VR in a similar manner to the performative interpretation of the past, which is involved in living history, where actors make use of clothes, tools, and practices of the past to present those witnessing a recreation of the world as it was. Now, living history has been providing a historical experience which is authentic and offering a recreation of the world. And that's a function which holds a particular appeal to heritage organizations, because it means you can really allow people to see the objects of the past as they appeared and how they functioned when they were part of people's lives. So, for instance, the RF Museum has a static display of tools, and it'd be much more interesting, I think, to users to see those transformed and not only used in their time, but also how they may have been misused. And that's one of the things that living history really can portray. And it's something which I think we can expect virtual reality experiences to offer in terms of recreating parts of the living history function, whilst also providing the simulation of situations impossible to otherwise recreate in the real world, and where users are nominally exposed to the same perceptual information as was experienced in the corresponding environment of the past. When users faithfully fulfill this virtual reality experience, and assuming a sufficient level of care and immersion has been provided, they derive some degree of empathy for the past. It does not, however, necessarily force the user to consider the motivations for the actions of rational historical actors, or demand that they engage with the history and reflect on it. So I think we need to be careful about the claims we make. It's often what the user already brings with them, which allows them to reflect on the past. So the lack of user agency when living the past, which is a characteristic of current historical VR experiences, can also be informative in terms of the historical past. If the user is on board a Lancaster, as in the Berlin Blitz experience, and it comes under attack by a night fighter, and I was going to play a clip for this, but my computer couldn't stand the strain. You witness the virtual tail gunner shooting down this aircraft, but you are a completely passive viewer to this. But I actually think that lack of agency provides a historically realistic sense of helplessness. In this situation, the inability to influence the course of events is itself an aspect of historical recreation of the experiences of those who suffered such an attack themselves. That lack of agency is therefore an opportunity for retrospection, insight, and historical understanding. And to be able to tell people that if you're sitting there and you're unable to do anything, how would you feel about it? And force them to be reflective on that, I think, is an opportunity. But for that to happen, the user experience has to be effectively mediated to draw the point out. And in the case of the Dambusters VR, that's not done. And a number of users across the different surveys asked for a greater level of interaction. What they wanted to do was perform the mission. They didn't just want to virtually participate in it. Now, VR doesn't just act as a way of historical understanding, but it can also provide primary sources through these interpretations. So they're not just an interpretation of the past. The BBC experience, for instance, uses archival audience. We hear the crew celebrating as the night fighter is destroyed. It's followed by the pilot asking in very clipped British tones that everyone not talk at once. So it's prosaic, accurate, and based on primary source material. The Apollo 11 VR, you can see here, was created with the mission to let VR users experience the first manned mission to the moon. And it includes a first-person interactive rocket launch, the lunar landing, and the first steps on the moon. However, the experience also incorporates original archival audio and video. Again, it's interesting to note that some of the reviews are really critical of the fact that you don't get to do very much. So it's just that passivity is something which a lot of people are frustrated by. However, the experience also incorporates, the Apollo 11 experience also incorporates original archival audio and video. It's therefore an attempt to provide both a first-hand experience of making that journey to the moon, whilst also offering historical information based on primary sources. And that's something which Time Magazine's historical VR experience called Remembering Pearl Harbor, VR Experience History, does very well. It's based on the reflections of Lieutenant James Downing, his personal account of Pearl Harbor, which was recorded when he was 103. It includes primary photos, unarchival footage, as well as the computer-generated virtual world. And in this way, virtual reality can act as repositories of first-hand accounts of the war, as well as providing interpretation and historical understanding through them. I think it's important to note that as the passage of time destroys the capacity for real memories, and as history constructs instead sites of memory as a social and encompassing symbiosis maintained through objects and performances, VR experiences offer a new means of constructing and also depositing memory. They offer the means to influence our subliminal points of reference, our unspoken points of address, and the very way we picture the past. And if I ask you to picture a Viking, most of you aren't picturing a farmer, I doubt. You're probably imagining, a fearsome warrior, nice big horns on his helmet. And that's something because we hold that visual picture in our mind. If you can create a virtual reality experience which shifts that, you can, in a way, shift historical understanding very effectively. And they also offer the prospect of doing this whilst reaching a broader audience, and that would be a really significant outcome. It's all too easy to forget that 1 in 5 people in Britain have seriously limited reading and writing skills. We're just not going to reach them through traditional means of historical understanding. So that's a significant outcome in itself, and it would have direct bearings on the wider public understanding of history. But I do think we need to be careful in thinking that just remembering the past and not providing a deeper understanding of it is a good thing. It risks history becoming the servant of the present trivialities. Indeed, memory of the past devoid of understanding as to its meaning result in what Paul Valery described as the most dangerous product that the chemistry of the intellect has invented. It makes nations bitter, arrogant, insufferable, and vain. And I think when we think about Second World War historiography, that's a risk which has serious dangers, and that's true of the virtual reality reflections of it as well. So whilst virtual reality offers the prospect of improving historical understanding, it also runs the dangers of perpetuating misconceptions of the past. Virtual reality experiences are instruments which, if properly exploited, offer historians the means to enhance their capacity to represent and analyze the past. We need to consider how to utilize and influence the development of historical VR to improve historical understanding and take advantage of a greater need for accuracy, their greater need for accuracy than previous created visual mediums. And I'd like to end on the words of the former RAF Chief of the Air Staff, considering we've just talked about the triviality of memory if it's devoid of any meaning. And this is Air Marshal Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Tedder, when he was unveiling a plaque for the Battle of Britain. He spoke to those who were gathered of how those who fought might view their memorial. Yes, that's a beautiful thing, a fine reminder of what we fought for. So what? What have you done? What are you doing? What are you going to do for the cause for which we did all we could? And I think the danger we run in just simply recreating history or the past and not interpreting it through these virtual reality experiences is we create a very shallow understanding of what our past is with dangers for our future. So thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you, Harry. That was wonderful. I came in too soon. And a talk that's sort of really interesting, I think, from my perspective, covered the kind of that relationship between public history and understanding, with a really rich sort of bit at the start, a rich cultural read, a rich critical read, actually, the technologies you were discussing around virtual reality. And I put it in the chat for the YouTube video, but there was a moment where I wrote down on my notebook here, is a living museum a fair parallel to some of what you've been talking about? And then about 2 minutes later, you launched into a discussion about living history, and you didn't quite say living museum, but started talking about very similar themes, which I thought was wonderful. I'm not going to take chair's privilege. I'm going to go to the chat on YouTube first, and then I'll come back through some of those comments and come back to me, and maybe also bring in Tessa, one of our other conveners who's in the room today. But I'll start with Nick Black, who asked a question on the YouTube chat saying that, do you think that a virtual reality experience are subsidiary to things like VR games, or kind of immersive first player games that allow you to follow historical themes, the kind of your Call of Duties, your Battlefields, etc. I guess the question then is, what do you feel that relationship is? Because I guess many users might come along having experienced an Oculus Rift in a game context, right? And actually they're given similar technology, but placed in a non-game, or at least what you're trying to present as not a game, right? As an experience, as an understanding portal instead.
Yeah, I think that it's important to note the difference between performative and participatory virtual reality. So when you're a participant and you're witnessing, which is the claim of these designers make in particular history, that's a very different thing from when you're trying to drive what's happening. And I think I'm not snobby about games being part of the way we can teach history. I think they're very important, but they're a different type of medium because of that. You are an agent of action within them, whereas within virtual reality, you're not. But I think it's very important. A lot of these issues do reflect previous mediums of communication. So for instance, in games and films, a lot of these issues are recreated in VR, they just take a different scope.
Can I pick back very quickly something you said there about agents of action? I think that's really interesting, because when I mentioned the parallels you made between living history and living museums, they are kind of quite person-centered, and you're not an agent in history, but you're an agent in your experience, I guess. And I think a lot of what you described here, particularly the kind of the fake haptics, I guess, of the kind of the balsa wood that's kind of put up and then in your VR experience is covered with a radio, for example, is not that, right? Whilst the living history, living museum does try to create a little bit of your sort of, you are an agent, even though it's a faux agent, you know what I mean? Is there something to be said there as well about that kind of, there's on one hand, there is a similarity to that living history stuff, but there's a bit of a split here going on with our relationship to what's happening.
Yeah, I think the important thing in living histories as well is that you can go up and have a completely unique interaction with the person who is involved in that living history. And at the moment, you can't do that in virtual reality. Conversational agents need to move a great way forward for that to happen, where you can create an artificial intelligence where the user will have a completely unique conversation when they engage with it based on their own knowledge and experiences being brought into the conversation. At the moment, they're just very hackneyed, sort of, you can either select a few options, or their responses are so limited that they tend to not be included in historic VRs because they would break the immersion.
But that's a really interesting comment, that actually might be an interesting direction that these things might move down as those conversational agents do improve. And I was reading my New Scientist recently, and they're improving alarmingly rapidly. So I just want to move to a slightly different point, if that's all right, which was a comment in the chat that Melody made when you were talking about the user experience when they kind of emerged out of those virtual reality spaces. And Melody's comment really was like wondering if there was or will you anticipate be some kind of Wikipedia effect here. The way in which people immediately maybe do fact checking, and the parallel being made here is something I've seen as well, as when you get to the end of a film that's supposedly based roughly on historical events, you've got a whole bunch of people in the cinema who are kind of suddenly checking Wikipedia to find out if what they've just witnessed is roughly true or not, or reviews that are telling them, well, you know, some of it is, but some of it isn't. Do you feel that that's kind of potentially a way in which people will experience these virtual realities in their kind of exit phase?
Yeah, I do think so. I think it's important to note that historical understanding doesn't have to happen then and there. And I completely agree with historical films being a good example of this. I went to see The Green Knight the other day, quite enjoyed it. Got home and, you know, I went on the internet to search for the origins of the story because I could remember it having read it, but I'm sure I can't picture this part. And I think that's true as well. I don't think it will happen immediately as users leave this particular experience, because you're immediately hit in this example with the Battle of Britain and a whole load of new aircraft to explore. So you go around, you come out, you've got more to experience in the museum. But when you get home, I do think the experience itself, it is, you know, a very stimulating experience. I do think it causes long-term sort of memories to be built. And I think people probably do then reflect on what they experienced, because there is a very empathetic response. So it'd be interesting to see what the long-term effects on historical understanding are, but I think they would be positive.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to come back to another comment from Nick in the chat as well, which is a kind of speculative question, kind of asking, you know, would a complete virtual reality museum ever be a kind of option in this space? I don't think anyone is just saying we should remove our physical museums entirely. But you know, is this a direction of travel you see within the industry? I guess when you talk to people who create these experiences, that they're starting to sell the idea that, well, maybe we could do this you don't have to go to Anne Frank's house at all and queue up for however many hours. You could just do that entirely from home. Is that starting to become a reality and people in the sector are talking about?
I think they're different experiences and they're worth considering, because particularly during the pandemic, we saw a big move to trying to offer these virtual experiences, even if they weren't virtual reality experiences of the museum. There's a big appetite for them. It allows people who are never going to be able to reach your museum to come there. In the case of Anne Frank's house, you can see Anne Frank's house without a huge crowd, which you can't do if you go to the original building. You know, and there's another one, Mona Lisa, for instance. There's a really good virtual reality which takes you deeper into the painting. Now you get to look at the Mona Lisa VR on your own. Whereas in the Louvre, you're surrounded by people taking pictures of it. Now, that's, you know, a completely different experience. It has its own value. Seeing the real object is always going to have a particular appeal, a particular value. But I do think that longer term, having sort of VR recreate certain aspects has a particular relevance for heritage organizations, being able to visit the sites. There's a great deal that can be done, and people have a more empathetic response to history when they see things, you know, in the round, you know. So I think that's a really important step forward, which will happen at some point. How well, I think it depends how far the technology is improved.
And I guess as many museum professionals would probably say that one of their experiences over the last couple of decades with the kind of integration of computational technologies into exhibition spaces would be that, you know, keeping those things up to date is a real challenge in terms of, you know, and we're talking here about historical understanding, and of course historical understanding is itself shifting on some of the things that we're talking about, and, you know, to do a heavy lift of kind of making a huge experience to then a few years later say, well, actually we need to make some changes because of our understanding of this history has changed would be a real undertaking that I don't think a museum would want to spend a huge amount of time on, you know, potentially.
I think there's three really important points there. I wanted to get all of them into my paper and didn't have room, which is one, that the past isn't static. You know, it's constantly changing. Our interpretations change. And that the danger through producing virtual realities, which will stay in public sphere for years and years to come, is that we actually do damage to historical understanding. We produce a sort of a false and shallow historical understanding, particularly if they're driven by commercial companies. In terms of the visuals, really important point. It's sort of, if you remember when GoldenEye came out on the N64, I'm sorry, showing my age perhaps, but it was, I can remember at the time saying to my brothers, this is as close to real life as computers will ever get, you know. And you look at it now and it's incredibly blocky. You can see the planes and angles and all the computer graphics. And this happens in the virtual reality experience as well. You know, some of the reviewers, as it gets dated, you get more and a lower review, because people come on and talk about, I think there was one quote for the Apollo 11 VR, the graphics are cheese. You know, that's the real criticism which was made. For the Dunkirk 360 experience, somebody asked, why did it go to PS2 graphics halfway through? And that is an effect which happens in VR, and it breaks the immersion. So I think that almost in a way counteracts the previous point, that there isn't this danger that that poor historical understanding will remain in the public domain for a long time, because unless you keep these graphics up to date, they lose their immersive appeal. And then the final point is cost, because particularly for museums, if you are paying what is often a very high price to develop these virtual, augmented or mixed reality experiences, no matter what you produce, you are almost compelled to make use of it, because you simply cannot afford to bin it. Well, that didn't go well. We don't like it. We think it's doing a bad job. Let's just cut the costs. You have sunk so much money into it, but there's an imperative to use it. I think that's quite a big risk as well.
I think that aligns with, there's a comment in the chat from Nick about the kind of relationship between VR and AR, which are kind of quite better for museums. And I guess better is a kind of very contextual term. And I've certainly experienced some really lovely kind of relatively low tech AR in museums. Colchester Castle Museum is a really good example, where they've integrated some lovely kind of just mobile interaction, a bit of augmented reality, which I hope for them is not a huge lift to keep maintaining and keep going, because it's a very different type of interaction than a kind of full immersive kind of thing, which might suffer that, as you call it, PS2 effect. I think I might use that phrase in the future.
I think AR is a very different technology. It does a different job, but I think the key to both is using them well. You know, you've got to put usability first, and the dangerous is that they know, oh, isn't it catchy to have VR in the title? You know, and we want to have an AR experience in the museum, but if that comes before what you actually wanted to do or how you're going to use it, you're running the risk that what you produce isn't really what the visitor wants. And so it actually has a negative effect on the experience. The key's got to be to immerse, immersive experiences within the museum.
I'm going to bring in Tessa now, if you'd like to come in, because I know you've got a question as well.
Yeah, hi. I was wondering about sort of, you were talking initially about the practical experiences or the practical problems that arise when you have VR as part of a normal exhibition, sort of, so that people who just want to see the regular one get annoyed and all of that. So, and I was thinking about recent ones that I visited where you sort of, where I thought like, okay, I got annoyed by this as well, or there were queues then all of a sudden and so on. So I was just wondering, is there like a sense of best practice of how to do it or how to embed it? Does it somehow create then a division who only come for the VR, or those who actually don't want to see that at all? Or sort of, is there a way to work with that and to make it sort of better for everyone?
I think the key has to be to make sure that if you're using these technologies, if they're just a standalone part of the museum and they're a commercial attraction, even if they are for historical interpretation, they can't detract from the rest of the museum experience. So you have to find a way of situating them where they don't stop other visitors having a good visitor experience. And if they are core to what you're doing in that museum, then you have to fully integrate them. You have to make sure that the interpretation around them is effective, that they all push in the same direction, because otherwise it becomes a very frustrating experience for users. Interestingly, for the RAF Museum's VR experience, one of the main criticisms people had when we did a much bigger survey, just in terms of users, seemed to be that they didn't know it existed. It was hidden. And that's a problem with a lot of technology. People either think they either don't see it, or they think it isn't for them. So we have people who have a very deep level of knowledge come to the museum, and they would say the VR experience isn't for me, that's for children. And interestingly, when we had people with that level of knowledge go on, they really enjoyed it, and they probably took more historical understanding from it from a lot of other people, because they brought their own knowledge into it. And it comes back to that audience member being part of the creation of this content. So I think it's a real challenge. You've got to start by saying, I want to integrate this effectively, rather than just, I've got to get it in there.
Thank you, Harry. So I can't see any other questions in the chat, but I do have a couple, if I may. And if, while I'm sort of talking and you're responding, maybe other people will come up with a quick question in the chat as well. My first one was about, you talked at one point quite early on about people being brought in to sort of almost fact check the initial kind of version of the Dambusters VR. And then later you talked towards the end, I think really powerfully about the importance of these VR experiences changing understanding, which of course was the kind of the main theme of your talk. And it made me think about that kind of both the link between factual and understanding. They're sort of the two I guess they're the two key thrusts of what's going on a lot of time with peer review of a kind of standard historical paper. We're looking on one hand as an expert to see, well, is this kind of right? On the other hand, is this changing our understanding of a particular subject in a way which we think is kind of can be backed up by the evidence that's been presented. And I wondered then, sort of from just thinking about that, what kind of a peer review in a way of a virtual reality experience like this would look like, which is not to say that like everything in the world should be peer reviewed, right? But museums go through processes where they think about how labels work, how exhibitions work. And you've obviously talked a bit about how this happened with virtual reality, but I wonder if this kind of whole experience and reflecting on it has made you think about sort of what kind of rough criteria we might start putting in place for when we develop experiences like this, and how we might then sort of go through a process whereby at the end we as professionals, but also the people who use them, can feel that they're seeing something that has gone through a process that means that we can trust it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right. We don't want everything in the world to be peer reviewed. God forbid, right? But I think certainly best practice, and it comes to Tessa's question as well, best practice is a really important aspect of this. I think probably sharing knowledge is one of the most important things we can do at this moment, because it's very early days in terms of using virtual reality effectively in museums, and being open and receptive to people asking these questions. And if things go wrong, not closing the door and saying, well, we don't talk about that. I think opening up and saying, this is what went well, this is what didn't go well, and not just sending these things out to commercial companies, paying them to develop them, and then including them no matter what. I think both at the start, during, and afterwards, engaging with other museums and other, your curators and the experts in your field, and asking their opinions is a very sensible thing to do. And I think it was, a lot of commercial departments get a lot of stick, and I'm not willing to give our commercial director, head of commerce, Barry, a get out of jail card if he's watching. He's going to get some stick at some point. But I think that's a really positive thing that they did in this case, that they went out and they said, before we say yes to this, we can see the commercial opportunities, but before we say yes, we want to make sure that it's historically accurate. I think that's a really positive thing that they did. And I'd encourage other museums to do that as well. Even when you're preparing the pitch, what is it that historians think about this topic? Is there a way of engaging with and incorporating that? And it would be better to spend some of the money, if you have to spend money to do that, it would be better to spend some of the money doing that than entirely on the virtual creative process, because you will get a better product, I think, at the end out of it.
Thank you. No other questions have popped into the chat since I started my first question, so I'm going to ask one final question, which was, I was really pleased at one point when I can't remember your exact words, but you said that that the VR experience is not a parallel for the actual experience of being there in this particular case in relation to wartime. And yet it made me think about the fact that these experiences are very kind of person-centered, and in a way, if we're thinking about experience, it's creating a sort of kind of counterfactual experience. It's not quite counterfactual, but it's on the edges of it. And I often come back to this theme in a lot of work with digital history and modeling in my head, because of Richard Evans's book on counterfactuals, and his kind of he's thinking about very different counterfactuals in that case, more kind of sort of the proper sort of what if questions, the econometric kind of what if questions. But he does come to a very clear conclusion that what ifs are a waste of time, and that what ifs often actually are people saying if only, and what ifs can in the end be kind of reactionary, kind of counterfactuals can be kind of reactionary fantasies in a way. And I'm not saying that these VR experiences are counterfactuals, but I guess there are parts of them, as with any experience of history, that in a way, particularly a person-centered experience of history, that can drift towards that counterfactual. And there is a temptation for us to feel like we are part of it in a slightly kind of counterfactual way. And I wondered if that ever comes up in your kind of thinking around VR experiences, whether you're offering a kind of a version of history that sort of people might, if we do it well, might almost take as a kind of a replication of reality, even though we give them the caveats that it's not quite like being there.
Yeah, I think that there's a real danger around using the term recreations for these virtual reality experiences. And, sometimes people do explicitly market them, and the RF Museum has been guilty of doing this at times on social media, of saying it is like you are there. It isn't like you are there. And I think that we risk creating, and we see in the surveys, this really did come out, quite a few people said, I now know what it felt like. I know what it felt like. You don't have a clue what it felt like. Unless you were there and you were able to explain it very well and articulately, and these guys didn't want to do that, you aren't going to know what it's like to be there. And so I think there's a real danger that people come away with that sense and with that thought. And I think that's dangerous, both in terms of how we view war, but also in terms of our collective memory. I think that's really dangerous. And it's really pertinent for military historians, I think, because there's so much appeal around military history. It's something which the public really engage with and like. It sells very well. And I think that's where a lot of VRs will focus their attention on. And the danger is we come away with this skewed sense of our history, particular British military history, which isn't helpful to where we want to go in the future. And I think that's probably the greatest risk around VR. And that's before we even get to the point that not all of the agents who engage with virtual reality are going to be good guys. They're going to be people who want to push false histories out. And there's a real risk if you're able to show somebody who doesn't believe in the Holocaust anyway, a counterfactual history where it doesn't happen, where you're able to airbrush it out of history and create something where people can see it and believe that they've gained a memory, which isn't true. I think that's a really worrying point where history could go.
Thanks, Harry. And I don't know if you know this, but you accidentally made a really lovely link that can segue into the next seminar. When our next seminar is Ben Lee, who was the inaugural Digital Humanities Associate Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and some of these themes may recur through his paper. So I'll come to that in a second, but I just want to start by thanking you so much for a really wonderful paper that took us into areas this seminar doesn't always go into, which is really that kind of critical museum studies and rethinking about that user experience interaction with history. But as I said before, it's really embedded in a kind of critical read of the technology, which I thoroughly appreciated. So thank you so much. And I hope you enjoyed it. Next time out, we have a very different seminar in some respects, but as I said, does have connections, which is on the 9th of November when Ben Lee from the University of Washington will be speaking about reimagining digitized newspapers with machine learning. And I hope to see many of you there. But before we go there, I want to just offer Harry once again our thanks, and hopefully in the chat you'll offer him thanks as well. Thanks, Harry.
Thank you, James.